Hi, I'm Susie Campbell, the other part of your Destination Enrichment Speaker team. You already know a little bit about me, but I'll just mention here I have a doctoral degree in neuropsychology, and I ran the Memory Disorders Clinic at the University of California, the Medical Center in Sacramento, and I actually did memory disorder testing, so if I forget what I'm saying, you understand. Anyway, I'm retired from that now because now Dawn's my full-time job. Today I'm going to share with you a personal snapshot of my experience visiting the Dani tribe in New Guinea. As you know, Dawn did a destination talk the other day and he spoke quite a bit about our trip, but this is going to go a lot more into depth and feelings and the point of view as a woman. Um, Also, the sound didn't come out for the replays on the TV, so I'm it. Okay, we made this trek just prior to joining you in Sydney, so it's really recent, and it was an amazing journey. Now, this presentation may make some of you squeamish. There'll be photos of both male and female nudity. Being a psychologist, none of that bothers me, but it might bother you. And there might be there's going to be some descriptive information on what little they do wear. So I hope you understand it and take it as very natural, which is what I did. If you have trouble viewing like programs on TV like National Geographic or Nature TV series, then you might want to not stay. Bye. The audience empties the room. Okay, here we go. February 27th, 2017. Dear Diary, today we are heading to the mountains of Papua, Indonesia, in western New Guinea. We're going to visit the Dani tribe. I have to admit I was quite apprehensive. I was concerned about traveling to Indonesia, where so many political uprisings are almost a daily occurrence. Not to mention Americans are not exactly in favor in this part of the world. And we were heading into an area of people who were, up until not that long ago, headhunters. Would we get ill or injured? Were we to be in any danger? Would I be up to making that trip both physically and mentally? Because all of our family and friends told us we were crazy. We took every precaution we could think of, from first aid kits to evacuation insurance. We notified the State Department of where we would be, and we updated our emergency contact sheet. And I want to tell you our wills too, but Don doesn't want me to tell you that. But now we're on our way, too late to back out. We departed from Bali for a 6-hour flight to Jayapura, Indonesia. There we checked our duffel bags in for a short flight to Wamena. The flight was full and no one spoke English. Dawn and I held hands as the plane took off. Aww. Wamena is a small city of about 8,000 people and located in New Guinea in the highlands of Papua. It sits about 1,500 meters or nearly 5,000 feet above sea level, and that's the bottom of the Baleen Valley. Will actually be going higher up in altitude. We were met at the airport by our guide, a porter, and a driver, just Dawn and I, and we needed 3 of them to help us, but it worked. I said, okay, it's going to be okay to myself, and I let out this big sigh of relief, thinking, oh, there's 3 of them and 2 of us. We'll have lots of help. Well, anyway, that lasted until our guide told us that his name was Phineas, and he smiled. His mouth was blood red from chewing betel nut. Now, that makes him high, so we don't know if this guy taking off with us is high or what's going on at this point. It stains and rots the teeth and the gums, and it's quite addictive, as you probably know. Just about everyone here chews betel nuts. We were told that children as young as 6 would chaw. I took a small bite of just the nut, and it was very bitter. Now, the nut itself on its own is not addictive. It does not make the red stuff. The locals get high from the chemical reaction of the betel nuts with powdered limestone. The fruit's peeled and the pit gnawed on. After you get it going a little bit, then you dip this green bean, dampened with saliva from your mouth, into this powder, which is really the lime, smashed up, the limestone. And the very caustic limestone combines with the juices of the nut, turning it bright red. At the busy terminal, there were several pygmies in line for flights. The cultural anthropologist in me wanted to chat so bad, but we had to move on. As we walked out, we were greeted by a Dani man wearing nothing but his penis gourd. Was I the only one to notice his nudity among all these men, women, and children going about their daily business? Apparently, it's so common here that none of the locals even seemed to notice or care. But I was so shocked I didn't even think of taking a picture, which is what he really wanted me to do because he wanted his dollar. So I'm like, okay, and I'm so stunned that I was separated from following Dawn and the guide back to the car. So the boys had to come back and get me, or I'd still be standing there gaping with my chin on my chest. We headed through town to a small grocery store. On the way, we saw several old men wearing just the gourd, walking through town without a care in the world. No one else blinked or even looked twice. Okay, I admit it, almost no one. I looked 3 times. Is this really happening? I pinched myself. We headed uphill to the Boline Valley Resort. It sits above 2,000 meters with a spectacular view over the valley. The 20-mile-long road took almost an hour and a half to navigate. For the last half of the distance, it's really just a huge puddle of mud with ruts and rock and very scary bridges. We had a 4-wheel drive, and we had to use it to get through some flooded areas and, again, all the mud. I was worried, women, we have to worry. So I worried about the metal rods, both in Dawn and I in our spines, because we both have had that done. So I jokingly called it the massage road. The lodge was one covered room with an eating area and a small desk for a lobby office. It was filled with a very large collection of Asmat art. The Asmat people live southwest of here, and we're told they're not very friendly, so we crossed that off our list. The wooden sculptures around the room included spirit poles, masks, and other carvings. When an Asmat warrior dies, the other men in his family go into the jungle and cut down a very large tree. This is carried into the village by men singing the praises of the deceased all along the way. When the carving is complete, there's a very intricate ceremony where the pole is carried out of the carving hut and erected outside the dead man's hut. Now, this is where they're kept until they finally decay and simply collapse. There are many works of art here in the lobby. They also include figurines and grass ceremonial costumes. These are the same ones as in the Michael Rockefeller exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. There, the artifacts are carefully preserved as they're priceless. Here at our bungalow complex, they're kept just this way as the Asmat people carved them, and that's sometime in the future, they'll just decay and be lost. The process has already begun. We were assigned a bungalow and made our way to number 4. The walk from the lodge to the room was a half-mile straight uphill, both ways. This was a trip we would need to make several times a day because we had to come down to the lodge to eat. It was quite arduous at this altitude. Between Dawn's limp and my shortness of breath, we thought, this is where our adventure ends if we can't even make it to our room. The bungalows, or hanais as they are called, were built in Dani style. They were nicely done and probably at one time here considered very special and really fancy. But now there is much deferred maintenance. The floors are warped, the doors and locks are barely functioning, and the wood is all water-stained. On the plus side, there's no phone, no internet, and no television. But that also meant we had no way to call down to the office should we have a problem. We entered bungalow 4 and found a large hive of bees swarming in it. It had a great view, but the risk of bee stings meant we had to be moved to another unit. I'm allergic to bee stings, so I still don't know if my heart was racing at that point because of the hill I just climbed or the fact that the bees were scaring me. So we were moved to another room. We took a nap. It's extremely quiet here, and it was really peaceful. But in the late afternoon, the skies opened up, and a just torrential rainstorm came down. It was unbelievable. We've never seen anything rain that hard before or any place. We opted to skip dinner rather than try to get down that path in this torrent, and so we stayed in for the night. It was raining too hard to make the half-mile trek to the lobby. What have we gotten ourselves into? I said. February 28th, 2017. Dear Diary, Today, we drove the long, bumpy road into Wamena to visit the local market. The women displayed their goods, nicely stacking the various vegetables and fruits to attract prospective buyers. The carrot stems were braided. Now, ladies, have you ever seen that in Safeway or any of those stores? And the corn was laid out in such neat patterns, and the fruit was all stacked like pyramids, just even and nice and unbelievably displayed. Now, we've been to hundreds of local markets around the world that are, dirt-based markets, and we've never seen the products so clean and nicely displayed. Women from the hills carry their produce, trade goods, and even their babies, as Dawn showed you, in a mesh bag suspended from their head. Each day, the women walk miles to take their goods to market and then return home with whatever she has earned. It might only be $1 or two. Now, I bought a bag. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but I'll just hold it up and I'll have it up here for later. But what they do is they just put this on top of their head, and leaves their hands free so they can carry fence material, housing materials, stone, rocks, and more lumber. So that's the women. They do everything. The local ladies who wove the purses, and that's what you're seeing here, got a laugh out of me trying to figure out how it went on my head. It smelled strongly of smoke, and I didn't realize it then. It wasn't until later I smelled the smoke on it. So I soaked it for a few days in vinegar. Now it smells like vinegar. The market we visited was crowded with people also selling fish, rabbits, chickens, and herbs. Traditional arts and crafts like stone axes, grass nets, and bows are also offered for sale. There was even a row where they were selling cellular phones, computers, and iPads. And here are these tables, all beat up. This is an outdoor market, and the men are sitting cross-legged behind their wares on the tabletop. Now, the women were sitting on the ground, and they had their wares, which is the produce there. I don't know how many sold. We didn't stick around for that. Anyway, the women were grooming each other. I'm not sure what it was they were finding. Head lice. We did see evidence of scabies on other local people, but we didn't get close enough to find out what it was. Okay. Next, we drove to a small market near the Wamena Bridge. Dawn stayed in the car while I walked with our guide, Phineas, through the market, then across the bridge to see rock being excavated. Here we bought sweet potatoes that we would have for dinner. They're a staple for the Dani. They eat them along with other vegetables and occasionally some meat. I ended up eating just the potatoes most of the time. While we were at this market, a tribe of Dani men marched through the town with bows and arrows. Yeah, just like you see here, this is it. They were chanting loudly and assuming warrior-like poses. Apparently, they were on their way to another village where there was some conflict going on, and this is how they get themselves all worked up and tell the rest of the town that this is going on. Soon, a large contingent of Indonesian police came into town with weapons and personnel carriers. They were obviously there to keep the peace. Everyone calmed down very quickly, including me. Our journey continued to the water power station at the upper course of the Wamena River. This plant was built by the English a few years ago, and it's its primary source of electricity for the town, and they're very, very glad to have it. At the power plant, there was a little girl and her brother. She was carrying a large kitchen knife, and several times she was holding it at him like she was going to stab him. Now, I'm not used to seeing little kids running with something sharp because didn't your mommy tell you don't run with scissors in your hand, right? So there's no adults around, and this village didn't appear to be very close by. But it turned out later we were going to see many children with large knives and no supervision that's apparent. So I had to admit, the first time I saw that, it was pretty alarming, but we made it through that one. We stopped at a small Dani village that consisted of 3 families. To get to the village, we had to walk across a very primitive bridge and then follow a path that was mostly made of logs put in the mud. Dani villages are almost always laid out in the same way, in the shape of an inverted U. The immediate house on the left, when you come in, is for the pigs, while the women and cooking are done in the middle huts. The chief, or men's hut, is always at the curb, the far end of the U, so they're more protected than the women. The village was surrounded by a wooden fence covered with a grass thatch to protect it from the nearly constant rain. The fence had two gates. The upper gate has a little ladder or just a tree stump to climb over the fence to gain access to the village. And here I am trying to climb over this thing, and I had to have two men help me, one on one side, one on the other. And they run over and back and forth across this in and out of their village, including the little tots that maybe just took their first step a few weeks before. Anyway, the lower gate was used for the pigs. Now, every morning, the pig gate is opened so that they can run out into the jungle to root for food. In the evening, it's open so the pigs can come back in. Somehow they know they have to come back to the village at that time and go into the pig's house and stay for the night. In contrast, the Asmat tribe doesn't have pig houses. They sleep with the women and children at night. We were greeted by the chief in the traditional Dani wear. As you can see, my first up-close and personal contact with the gourd was uncomfortable, to say the least. And he wanted to shake hands. Like, yeah, okay. We were told that he was the father of all the children in the village. The chief was not sure how old he was, but our guide thought he was most likely in his late 70s or early 80s. They don't record their births here. No one knows for sure their true birth dates or even a year. We had encountered this before with the Maasai in Africa. Their way around it is because some of them were doing more traveling, and to get passports, they would just kind of guess by what their mother said it was after some big monsoon, and that could be looked up and found out what year they were born, and then they just pick a date. But they don't even pick a date with the Dani. Back at the lodge, we reflected on what we learned about the penis shield called a koteka. Many of you asked questions, so here it is. I'm going to get all the way right up front. They're made from specially grown gourds. Stone weights are tied to the bottom of the gourd to stretch it out or curve it as it grows. When harvested, the gourd is emptied and dried, and some tribes decorate them. They appear to be held on by a string tied around their waist and the other string tied around their scrotum. Many of the tribes can be identified by the way they wear their koteka or the style. So some particularly don't like the curve and others like it decorated, and I don't know, we bought 4 of them. They're in Bali. We picked them up in Bali. All right, March 1st, 2017. Dear Diary, the countryside here is amazingly beautiful. Towering mountains, deep valleys, lush green jungle, and fast-moving rivers. Here I am with our porter traversing one of the bridges. He had given me a walking stick earlier, but I'm still very afraid of falling. So you see, I have a lot of fears and worries, and anyway, they do go away eventually. I'm afraid of cruising. Oh, too late. This morning we headed out to the village where they had a mummy of a chief. The mummy itself seemed as though it had been coated with tar. Apparently, he had just been dried with salt. He passed away over 300 years ago. Around the mummy's neck, there were rattan strings. I don't know if you can see them. Yeah, you can't see them here. And that's how they knew how old he was, because every year they would put a new cord. It didn't look like there were 300 strings to me, but over time, the older cords had simply rotted and fallen off. This was a larger village than the one we visited yesterday, but laid out in the same way. We were allowed to photograph the mummy and the people of the village after an exchange of money that amounted to about $1 per person. Some wore chicken and cassowary feathered hats like the one they put on my head, and I really wanted it, but I knew I couldn't get that past Australian customs. There were a few people here wearing street clothes. It was obvious they had more visitors from the West than some of the other villagers, and probably because their attraction is come see the mummy. They didn't seem as friendly, but maybe they're experiencing the growing pains of coming into an unfamiliar culture at an unfamiliar time in their life. We trekked over to another village and were greeted by a chief whose name was Yeli. He was very proud of his village and very friendly. He also didn't charge for us to take their pictures. It was quite a bit further in the mountain. Yeli wanted to talk to us because he knew some English, just a small amount. And he was able to sign his name, but it took him quite a while to do so, and it was very um, small and crimp. But it was obvious he didn't practice it a lot. We gave him a world map, and we marked on it where we came from. Here's California, and where he came from. Here's Papua, and he was very happy with it. We didn't want to give them candy and cigarettes, which is all they asked for. They would go, like this, the hand signal, I want a cigarette. We tried to educate our guide as to their harm, but he either hadn't heard it before, or it was just too unbelievable what we were saying, or he didn't want to hear it at all because he didn't want to have to quit smoking. I don't know what happened, but that conversation went nowhere. So then Don and I contemplated that night. Well, who are we to impose our society's mores on another person? Yeah, but on the other hand, we don't want to pass on some things that might kill them, or probably do. So we finally gave in to the candy, but not the cigarettes. It's a tough decision. An old woman sat down next to me at this village with Yelly. She only had stumps where her fingers had been. In the Dani culture, the chief's wife cuts off a finger at the knuckle, the first joint, when a relative dies. In the jungle and using a stone axe, she cuts her own fingers off. And she motioned to us, she didn't speak any, but she motioned to us. It didn't always happen in one cut. She might have to do, so the pain must have been really extreme. This is apparently one of their ways of mourning the loss of a loved one. I would think the loss of a loved one would be sad enough without having to, go through anything else. But I took her hand between mine as if to say, I'm sorry, and, show some empathy. And she looked at me with her aging, watery eyes as if to say, thank you. We had a global understanding beyond words. The men had pierced nasal septums. If they didn't have a boar's tusk or a wooden ornament in their nose, you could see the hole. But then they would take it in and out and show us it really was there. It wasn't one of those fake spring things or anything. And they did it to give themselves a much fiercer look, of course. That worked for me. And it also gave all new meaning to the term deviated septum. Then we trekked further into the jungle for a picnic lunch that our porter carried in for us. As we were walking along the path toward our picnic area, two very, very large hogs got into a tussle, and it seemed like they were starting to run for me. Yikes, now I'm really scared. So the adrenaline kicks in. Do I flight, fight, or barter? No time to decide. Let's fight. I took my stick, and ever the warrior, I immediately put it and assumed a stance ready to smack them both on the head. The sight of a 70-year-old woman in attack pose must have terrified the pigs because they quickly ran away. He couldn't believe I was doing that. Thank you. Well, okay, maybe they weren't so big and fierce. Pigs are not only bred for their meat, but they have become a status symbol among the Dani. They are still the main dowry in exchange for women. It might cost 8 or even 10 pigs for a man to get a wife. A large, healthy pig can be worth up to $1,500 or more. That's a fortunate place where people only make a subsistence living. We headed back to the resort for the evening. I laid down in our honai and looked up. On the ceiling, directly over my bed, over my head, there was a huge spider. With its legs spread out, it was nearly the size of Don's hand. So much for my bravery. So ever the mighty hunter, Don knocked it down with his walking stick and quickly dispatched it so that I could sleep peacefully. Ah. And then we were laying there and we realized it was Ash Wednesday. And because the missionaries were here with the tribesmen in the 30s and 40s, most of the Dani are Christian, and the tribe we had visited that day were actually Catholic. And many had the sign of the cross in ash on their forehead. And not only that, but you'll see pictures too where they're wearing a cross around their neck, but, with their penis shield. And, it's just kind of, okay, well, it works for you, it works for me. March 2nd, 2017. Dear Diary, This morning we waited for the rain to let up before heading out to a traditional pig feast at the Dani village. It was only a few miles away, but the road was very rough. Finally, our driver could go no further, and we had to trek in the last mile or two. The mud in the road was insidious and very sticky. We sank down into it, and it grabbed us, making it difficult to pull our shoes out. Ever the drama queen, I thought we were in quicksand. You like that? After a long uphill climb both ways, we stopped at a large outcropping of rock. Against the rock were stacks of wood, spears, and arrows, and you can kind of see the woods there, but you would never know there was a path there hidden away to get down to their village. So the very narrow, steep, and muddy trail took us down, very steep trail, and under there was a depression in the other side of that rock face that sheltered us from the rain. We were told to wait there. We didn't dare enter a village without permission. After at least half an hour, our guide thought he heard the village chief call to us to come in. Ah! All of a sudden, out of nowhere, there was a loud scream. Above and behind us on a tower we didn't even know was there was a Dani warrior with a bow and arrow. He shouted warnings to us and alarms to the village people. Then he shot an arrow at us that landed within feet. Not kidding. From both sides of the jungle came other warriors from a rival village. They were in full war paint and armed. To say I was frightened would be putting it mildly. Now what do we do? Fortunately, our guide started laughing and told us it was a mock battle. The men then lined up to sing chants and dance for us. Having no fear and ever the adventure, I went into the midst of the men and joined in their singing. I'm not sure they knew what to make of me, nor did my husband. In addition to saying wah, 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 which means welcome, they want you to give them gula gula or candy. Gula is sugar, so of course gula gula is sugar sugar, meaning hard candy. By the way, the white you see on their legs here was not clothing, but mud. We were escorted up to the village gate where we were greeted with a welcoming dance. I'll play a clip here so you can hear it. The other one, guys. Then we were treated to lunch. They started the cooking fire by using friction. We were hoping we weren't going to be the lunch. As the women of the village sang a fire song, the chief pulled the rattan cord back and forth on the wood until it was hot enough to get the grasses on fire. Once a spark was obtained, it was handed over to the women. They were supposed to blow on it and keep it burning. That was their task. And all this is being done as it's raining on and off, so it did go out a couple times, and they just persevered. Large logs were placed around the small fire, and stones were placed inside the logs. More and more wood was added along with more and more stones. Next to it was the pit used for cooking. It was about 6 feet across and 4 feet deep, so pretty good-sized pit. Now it was time to prepare the pig. This is where I didn't look, so if nobody wants to look, it's okay with me. A woman chased a little one out of the pig's house. Little cute, oh dear. It was held by 2 men by its front and back legs, and I really couldn't watch. The chief's son shot the pig through its heart. It squealed for a long time after they dropped it on the ground. It took about 10 minutes until it finally died. The pig was thrown into the fire to sear its hair off. That's when I lost my appetite. As the fire was heating the stones, the pit was being prepared. The chief's son jumped into the pit and neatly laid out these long grasses from the bottom of the pit and up and out to about 5 feet from its edge. You can see that here. Once he was satisfied that the pit was ready, it was time to move the stones from the fire, that now they're the hot stones, to the pit. Using long split poles like giant tweezers, other men and women picked up the hot stones from the fire and placed them in the pit. They started by covering the whole bottom with stone, and then they built a wall of hot rocks all the way around the rim until it was about 1 foot above the ground. The women placed greens, sweet potatoes, corn, and other vegetables into the pit. They were just raw. They were apparently, no prior um, getting it ready like we do. Each layer was covered with a layer of edible ferns. You know, the ones we have in our house? What are they called? The Boston ferns? That's what they ate. The chief butchered the pig. Using a bamboo knife, he cut the ears and tail off the pig. These were taken into the chief's hut where they would be consumed later. We didn't ask if they'd be heated or cooked first. Some things you don't want to know. It's TMI. Next, the chief cut open the carcass and removed the internal organs of the pig. Using a stone axe and bamboo tools, he skillfully prepared the pig for cooking, breaking the spine and major joints so the meat could be more easily divided after the pig was cooked. Now, all this time, we're sitting closer than Dawn and I, like from here to here, from all of the events taking place. And it was just Dawn and I. And every once in a while, we get up and move a little closer to take some pictures. But it was pretty intense being up close and personal. The children delighted in playing with the raw, bloated entrails. The women took the innards to the stream to wash them. They would be cooked for later consumption. Finally, the pig was placed on top of the pile of other foods in the pit, followed by more ferns and more hot rocks. The grasses that had been laid out from inside the pit were pulled up around and tied by long rattan vines, and the vines were tied to each other to make these ropes longer and longer. And with each wrap, they pulled it tighter and tighter, and they'd all gather around like this and just keep pulling this thing tighter and tighter so it formed the ball and really squished it all in. It was kind of like a large grass pressure cooker. And then they took a bucket of water and threw it on there so it would also steam. While dinner was being cooked, the parents rested and the kids played. The chief had two little boys who delighted themselves by throwing small spears. They were really quite good at it. They seemed to like doing it as for fun, as well as to impress us, because every time this little one would throw one, he'd look back at me and I go, oh yeah, and so he'd go do another one. It was really cute. And it was obvious that the chief was very proud of his boys. Don took the opportunity to look in the men's hone and give gifts to the chief to distribute. We learned long ago that when you do go somewhere and you are bringing gifts, you don't try to hand them to each individual child or to each, adult or to some people. You always give to the chief, and the chief will distribute them, and then there's no fights and no problems. Inside the chief's hut, it was covered with a thick layer of black soot, as you can see here, and that was because the living houses all had fires on the ground level, and they had an upper level where they slept because it was warmer. But the rest of the houses all had two levels and similar construction as far as height, thatched roofs, and dirt floors. The chief welcomed the gula gula, and he called to the children to get some treats. Just like kids everywhere, they were thrilled. One difference from what we experienced at home, though, is there was no squabbling about who got what. They each got the same amount, no matter what their age or size. It's one way to end that fight, huh? I blew bubbles for the children. We brought some bubbles with it so we could interact with them. And we showed them how to do it, and then I handed them the bottle, and they went off doing it on their own. But it was great fun to watch them play and laugh and jump and squeal with delight. So while we're waiting now, we're playing with the kids while we're waiting for our meal to cook. And I want to just show you a few photos that we took of the children while our dinner was cooking. He had a lollipop in his mouth. All grown up with her purse like mom's. It came time to open the cooking pit. The giant tongs were used to remove the hot rocks. The steaming grasses were pulled back and laid on the ground. The women and children came over and actually sat in a circle on around the pit, but right on the grass, which was still kind of steaming. It cooled off fast. But amidst this grass now is various greens that were to food, and the corn and the sweet potatoes and everything else. So they would just sit there sitting in this grass and pick at the bits that was eligible for eating out of there, and enjoyed it. The pig was removed from the pit by the chief and divided up into much smaller pieces, very small. It was a small pig, and it was, a medium-sized tribe, maybe 30, maybe 40, say, yeah, give or take. The choicest morsels were taken to the men's hut and offered to us, our guide and porter. We didn't want to hurt their feelings, as the pig was a treat reserved for special occasions, but we didn't eat it. At night, particularly when there's a full moon, the Dani go into the jungle to obtain other protein. They hunt birds in a small marsupial called a couscous. There doesn't appear to be much meat on them. Besides, could you eat anything this cute? Aw. Back at the pig feast. For dessert, they poured a red liquid over their greens. First, the long red fruit that had been cooked with the pig was placed in a wooden bowl. It was kneaded and squeezed, adding water as needed. It made a bright red pulp with the consistency of yogurt. This was divided up into small bowls and spread around just as the rest of the meal had been. And they would dip the fern that had been cooked into this red and eat it like that. We didn't try this either, as consuming the water they used in its preparation was probably not in our best interest. What a day. It had stopped raining, and it was time for us to go. The climb down from the village to the bridge and then back up the road was a little easier this time. The mud had begun to dry, and it was not as slippery. We looked back at the top of the rock cropping, and the young people from the village were there waving at us. You can see them up there, to say goodbye. That said it all. Goodbye. I don't know. Nobody has any questions, right?